Bloomberg Audio Studios.
Podcasts, radio, news.
You're listening to the Bloomberg Balance of Power podcast. Catch us live weekdays at noon Eastern on Apple CarPlay and Android Auto with the Bloomberg Business app. Listen on demand wherever you get your podcasts or watch us live on YouTube.
Thank you for being with us on Bloomberg TV and radio, the Wednesday edition of Balance of Power. I'm Joe Mathieu in Washington. Kailey Leinz is on assignment as we pick up the pieces from debate night, but also bring you breaking news from Washington. Amazing how things can change in 24 hours. We were talking at this time yesterday about a looming vote on a stopgap measure that Speaker Mike Johnson had brought forth to kick the can on government funding 6 months down the road, knowing that funding expires September 30. This was not expected to be easy. Tied with the SAVE Act, Democrats didn't like it, wasn't expected to pass the Senate, even if it did pass the House. Now it's not happening today. As we report, the Speaker talking to reporters earlier, there will be no vote today on the short-term spending plan to avoid a government shutdown. They're going to work through the weekend, it seems. In fact, we may not see a vote now until next week. Remembering, time is tight. And this is going to be an interesting debate. Donald Trump saying on Truth Social yesterday, Republicans should not vote for any stopgap unless it does come with the SAVE Act, which Democrats remind tries to solve a problem that is not in existence because it is already illegal for non-citizens to vote in elections. Now, that's where we start our conversation with someone who had his eyes on the debate last night and, of course, was in Lower Manhattan this morning on this anniversary of 9/11. That would be Dan Goldman, Democratic Congressman, New York's 10th District, with us live from Capitol Hill. Congressman, it's great to see you. Thanks for coming back. Did Republicans' rhetoric change on this stopgap after the debate last night?
I don't actually think the debate had that much to do with it. I think it was very clear that for a variety of reasons, there were numerous Republicans who did not want to move forward with this. Some understood that billions of dollars would be underfunded for veterans, for the military, for our national security if this went a full 6 months. And others realized that this was a non-starter. It was never going to ultimately become law, and it was playing more brinksmanship with a government shutdown. And the Republicans would have held responsibility for that a month before the election.
Are you worried about a shutdown, or is the Senate going to solve this for the House once again?
Look, I'm always worried about a shutdown, but I think we've been through this several times before, and we've seen it, and we know how it's going to play out. And it's going to play out ultimately with Speaker Johnson needing the Democrats to pass a short-term stopgap 3-month CR. That is exactly what has happened the last couple times that we've been through this brinksmanship. And it's bewildering why he continues to do it again and again and again. It's the definition of insanity to think that something will be different. But here we are recognizing 3 weeks before that this is not going to happen.
This is a familiar feeling, I'm afraid, Congressman, to your point. We've seen this movie before. The talk is then, if not 6 months, 3 months. Is that what happens? We fund the government through the end of the year, and whoever wins the election, the next president, is going to have to deal with this problem on day one.
Well, I think part of the point of actually doing it in mid-December is so that whoever becomes president does not have to deal with this on day one, that we will get it done before the new president, who I believe will be Kamala Harris, takes office on January 20th. And that's the way it should be done, and that's the way that I expect it to be done. But it just goes to show, Joe, how consistent and continuous the Republicans are in playing games with our government, with our national security, with our veterans, with the things that matter to the American people. And it is political brinksmanship after political brinksmanship. They are not serious about doing the actual work to solve the problems for the American people. That has been the story this entire Congress, and that is why Democrats need to win in November so that Democratic majority can actually do the work for the American people that the Democrat majority did in the last Congress, and that basically the Democratic minority has done this Congress, because everything that has passed Congress has required Democrats.
Well, if the idea here is then to do a stopgap through December and then somehow craft a real budget with 12 spending bills in regular order, it would take a Christmas miracle, Congressman. And I would love to be talking to you about that if it gets that far by the end of the year. But I want to ask you about the debate last night. I know you were watching here, and I know the matter of Ukraine is important to you. Or support for the war in Ukraine, knowing that you were the lead counsel in the first impeachment against Donald Trump, which brought us back to the original perfect phone call, as we all remember. Donald Trump said a couple of things last night. If he had been president, this war never would have started. Vladimir Putin never would have invaded Ukraine. He also said if Kamala Harris gets elected, that this is going to take a very different direction. Do you believe that's true, that this war would not have happened with Donald Trump in office?
Absolutely not. The war happened because Donald Trump had messed around and undermined our alliances with our allies, to the point where there was so much discord and disagreement between Donald Trump and our closest allies that Vladimir Putin believed that it was the opportune time for him to make his illegal and improper invasion of a democratic state, Ukraine, next door to him. And the reason why Vladimir Putin so desperately wants Donald Trump to be president again, and why he is paying social media, right-wing media, to promote Russian propaganda to help Donald Trump win, is because he knows that he has Donald Trump wrapped around his finger. And the reality is Donald Trump could not even say last night that he wants the democratic Ukraine to beat and win this war against the dictator Vladimir Putin from Russia. That is all you need to know. This man coddles up to dictators, and he undermines democracy both here at home and abroad. And it's why so many of the national security officials who worked for Donald Trump have said that he is unfit to be president and that they are supporting Kamala Harris. This is a critical issue, and that specific answer was so telling as to who Donald Trump is and what kind of presidency a Trump 2.0 would be. It would be a red carpet for Vladimir Putin to take over Ukraine and expand into Europe.
Well, it's interesting because Kamala Harris said last night that if Donald Trump were elected, Vladimir Putin would be sitting in Kyiv right now. But the fact of the matter is, Congressman, we've talked to the president of Poland. President Duda sat here right at the table with us. We had the same conversation with Oksana Markarova, the ambassador of Ukraine to the United States. When we asked them about what a Trump 2.0 would mean for U.S. support for NATO and the war in Ukraine, they both said, hey, Donald Trump gave Ukraine lethal weapons when others would not, and he deserves credit for that. Are they wrong?
Well, that is factually correct, but then he withheld those lethal weapons in order to coerce and extort the president of Ukraine to make up a bogus investigation to help Donald Trump's election and his electoral prospects. And so, yes, on the one hand, that's right, but this is the problem with Donald Trump. You can't trust him, because when push comes to shove, he will always put his personal interest over the country's. And so he may do something the right way because he doesn't care about it, he's not paying attention to it. But if he finds something that he can do that can help him personally, he will always do that. And that's why he got impeached the first time, is because he illegally withheld essential military and financial support for Ukraine against Russia. And so that's obviously why Vladimir Putin is so eager for Donald Trump to become president again.
You know, you saw it, Congressman. Donald Trump was given several occasions last night, several opportunities to say that he wanted Ukraine to win the war. Each time he would simply say he wanted the war to end. How do you interpret that?
I interpreted it exactly as you did, which is it's one thing if he perhaps doesn't answer the question once, but I believe he was asked 3 times, and he refused to say that he preferred that the democratic, independent, sovereign nation of Ukraine that was invaded by a dictator, Vladimir Putin, would win the war. And then when he talks about in grandiose terms how, and he consistently does this, he would end it on day 1 before he's even president. And you ask him, how are you going to do that? Never once has he provided any information about how he's going to do that. And we all know the reason why. And Vice President Harris said it last night, because he will just allow Vladimir Putin to walk over Ukraine and to take over Kyiv and to take over a democratic nation for the first time since World War II. So you don't have to dig deep to figure out what Donald Trump wants. He makes it very clear, and what he wants is for dictators and strongmen like Viktor Orban, who he bragged about, and Vladimir Putin to be his friends. Those are his models, not democracies like Ukraine.
Well, Congressman, you represent New York's 10th district, and this is an awfully important day here, this 11th of September, for the people in your district, for you, for the people of New York City, for everyone who's listening and watching this right now. I was struck this morning to see the images from Lower Manhattan in this memorial service that we've grown so used to every year, to see Joe Biden, Kamala Harris, Donald Trump, all standing together to pay tribute. What does that tell us about the significance of this day?
Well, it tells us many things. First of all, this was the anniversary of the worst terrorist attack against the United States on U.S. soil in history, and it is critical that we never forget that we have enemies abroad who want to destroy us, and that still remains the case. It's also a time to appreciate and remember all of the first responders who so bravely went into ground zero, into the towers first, and then cleaned off the pile, many thousands of whom are now suffering from mental health consequences, or rather health consequences. But the other thing, Joe, and I think this is really important, 9/11 was a day that brought all Americans together, whether you were Democratic or you were Republican or you were independent or nothing. That day, we were all Americans. And this morning, as we stood there at 9/11, we were just Americans, there to commemorate one of the worst days in American history. And it is really important, even in our divisive and polarized political times, that we remember we are all Americans. We all love this country. We all want this country to be better. And that was, to me, so much of the takeaway this morning as I stood next to Rudy Giuliani and J.D. Vance and Donald Trump and President Biden, Vice President Harris, Senator Schumer, Governor Hochul. Yes. It didn't matter what parties we were for this day, because we were commemorating an American holiday, which is now 9/11.
It's incredibly important, Congressman, and I appreciate your answering that question, and I'm glad that you were there for us today, because I'll tell you what, waking up this morning, I have rarely felt further away from that moment, and so many of us wonder how we can get back to it without a tragedy. Great to be with us today on Bloomberg. Congressman, thank you. Dan Goldman, New York's 10th District, live from Capitol Hill. He's made his way back to Washington, as many lawmakers have, following the tributes this morning in New York.
You're listening to the Bloomberg Balance of Power podcast. Catch us live weekdays at noon Eastern on Apple CarPlay and Android Auto with the Bloomberg Business app. You can also listen live on Amazon Alexa from our flagship New York station. Just say, Alexa, play Bloomberg 1130.
We do thank you for being with us here on Bloomberg TV and radio, and on YouTube, where you can always find us. Search Bloomberg Business News Live. On this 11th of September, 2024, a lot of us noticed the weather when we woke up this morning here in Washington and in New York. That clear blue sky, the fall temps. Felt a lot like it did 23 years ago, and you keep seeing the hashtag or hearing people say, never forget. You'll see a lot more of those today. The fact of the matter is, if you were in Washington that day, or in New York, or in Pennsylvania, if you smelled the smoke, felt the fear and the confusion, you couldn't possibly forget. And of course, that goes for Americans all over the country who woke up that morning to find that news on their way to work or as they were packing up the kids for school. It changed their worldview. But you advance this story 23 years later, and the ceremonies, the names being read, the chimes being heard, means something different for a lot of young people who don't remember it or who were not alive when it happened. And that brings us to an important op-ed this morning in the Philadelphia Inquirer by the former governor of Pennsylvania, Mark Schweiker, writing about remembering 9/11 and advancing the lessons that we learned that day to the next generation. It is important to acknowledge, he says, the legislation signed into law in June by Governor Josh Shapiro, which established a moment of silence in our schools on 9/11 to be observed yearly. The sponsor of that legislation, Rep. Jim Haddock, had the unanimous support of the Pennsylvania General Assembly. Former Governor Schweiker also hoping that everyone will pause on 9/11 every year in a moment of silence. And you wonder if there is more that is needed to remember. He's with us right now in Pennsylvania, as a matter of fact, in Philadelphia this morning after the debate. And Governor, it's good to see you here. People should know that you became governor as a direct result of 9/11 when Tom Ridge was called to Washington to run the new Department of Homeland Security. And you've lobbied and worked closely with the families of 9/11. What is your thought now as you talk to people in their early to mid-20s and think about their kids 10 or 20 years from now in advancing the lessons that we learned 23 years ago?
Well, I think there's an American instinct to understand more about it, to know more about it, to inquire about it. I think for those of us on the front line, Joe, as you've already emphasized, it's a day never to be forgotten out of respect for the families. And that day, by the end of the day, 2,996 Americans had perished. So we're not going to forget it anytime soon. But relative to younger folks, I do believe that they want to understand what occurred, what led us to that point, and that they're inclined to be a storyteller of sorts so that it's handed down over generations through families as well.
Mm-hmm. You write and remind us, by the way, it wasn't just the almost 3,000 people who died that day. Nearly as many first responders have died after 9/11 as those who perished in the moments after the terror attacks. Within 3 years, more than 70,000 people suffering from physical and mental health issues related to the attacks. This is something the nation had to deal with, Governor, and you remember the moments that followed 9/11, the unity that so many people have tried to reach back to and recreate since then. It has never been duplicated. Why not?
Well, so to speak, America has moved on. Here we are. You mentioned this also, 23 years later on this gorgeous Wednesday morning or Wednesday afternoon now. That life, so to speak, is somewhat back to normalcy. We don't feel threatened by external forces. They couldn't be more wrong. Think about this. Not too long ago, there were 8 would-be tourists from Tajikistan. 2 of them were in Philadelphia. In my estimation, probably casing locations in and around Philadelphia, because in 2026, when we celebrate the 250th birthday of this great country, this longest running democracy in the history of the world, I don't think they were here looking for places to buy hot dogs or ice cream, probably casing the place, as law enforcement would say. So we've got to stay on top of our game. If anything, on this gorgeous Wednesday, it's also about proper reflection, commemorating those who perished, and relative to Homeland Security, that it's more than just a moniker, more than just 2 words. Individually speaking, and certainly those who serve in high levels of government, state and federal and county and so on, need to be extra vigilant as these kinds of incidents occur. So I think 9/11 can be not just about commemoration, even though that's the lion's share of the emotional aspect today. Staying on top of our Homeland Security game and remaining vigilant is essential as well.
As we spend time with former Pennsylvania Governor Mark Schweiker with us in a very busy downtown Philadelphia this day after the debate. Of course, Governor, we have to remind ourselves that we would not have had a debate last evening about the U.S. withdrawal from Afghanistan if it were not for the events that took place 23 years ago today. This has become a big point of contention in this debate. And as you support one candidate or the other in this race, and you can tell me where you're going to fall on this to the extent that you're involved in this election cycle. Does Kamala Harris deserve some of the blame for the way that withdrawal was conducted?
Well, individually speaking, I'm like most Americans. I'm paying very close attention to every minute and every rhetorical turn of last night's debate. Individually speaking, along with my wife, we'll make a decision in due time. As I see it, relative to Afghanistan, it was, by most military accounts, most third-party independent accounts, it was a messy withdrawal. Lives that, in the assessment of many, did not have to be lost if there were a thorough, sensible strategy for exit from Afghanistan. So I do think that the president bears some responsibility here. The current president, President Biden. As I see it, it's a bit of a reach to suggest that the vice president and management decision fingerprints was on that maneuver that day. On the other hand, it's an administration that bears responsibility. So I sensed last night a bit of defensiveness on her part. But as I see it, Joe, we're in a situation now where we've got to be talking about just living and the aspects of shopping and the extra expense in the supermarket. We've got to talk about preserving Pennsylvania's economy, which is heavily dependent on natural gas and extraction technologies. So in that regard, I stand here as a longtime Pennsylvanian. Those jobs and paychecks need to be protected as well. So aside from what happened in Afghanistan, let's talk about what's underway in the rural areas of Pennsylvania and the prospect of should that industry be diminished, that means jobs and paychecks are taken away from Pennsylvania residents.
Well, I'd like to talk about that. Do you take Kamala Harris at her word that she would not ban fracking? What does that mean for voters in Western Pennsylvania?
In my assessment, as it stands today, other than some areas of Pennsylvania, largely urban, across the state, there are great misgivings about her seeming comfort years ago to say fracking needs to be stopped. And at this point on this gorgeous September afternoon, I believe there are an awful lot of Pennsylvanians who believe they cannot take her at her word.
Josh Shapiro, of course, is not one of them. I think you're a fan of the governor. Is he the best asset she has in Pennsylvania?
Without question. I mean, Josh Shapiro is someone that has won a number of elections. I think it confirms he knows how to compete, both on a rhetorical and public policy choice level. I think in sensible fashion, he has made it clear that we're not in a state government is not in the business of destroying the local economy. It's about sensibly helping it. In that regard, federal attitude on some counts, and yes, as expressed by the vice president, the idea that fracking should go away, that is Hillary Clinton-like here in Pennsylvania. If you remember, let's look back. A couple of years back when Hillary Clinton was competing against Donald Trump, she made, I think in the estimation of many, the rhetorical misstep and said, in West Virginia, these coal jobs are going away. Well, you know what happened in West Virginia? And you can't, as I see it, it's not the job of an office holder or a nominee to say, I want to take away your job and paycheck. In effect, that's what it means. So as I see it in some on this September day, kind of a no blood outcome to last night's debate. And the Pennsylvanians will be looking very closely at how they comport themselves between now and November 5th, particularly on economy building efforts and particularly on natural gas, because Pennsylvania, after Texas, is the #2 producer. We are talking about jobs and paychecks for regular Pennsylvanians. So I think they're going to have to step very carefully relative to, and I think, listen to Josh Shapiro. I think he's got it right.
Fascinating conversation. And it sounds like Kamala Harris has more convincing to do to get Pennsylvanians to vote for her. I only have 30 seconds, Governor. Is Tim Walz the right man to deliver that message to your state?
As I see it, His outlook is really all about a growing role, and this is odd coming from a state's governor.
Yeah.
Generally, it's an assertion that the federal government should be a central force in American life. I don't believe most Americans see it that way, and regardless of the issue or the policy proclamation that he shares, it's a suggestion that the federal government should be bigger in our life. I think most Americans question that direction.
All right, Governor. Mark Schweiker, the former governor of Pennsylvania, with us on this 23rd anniversary of 9/11 on Bloomberg.
You're listening to the Bloomberg Balance of Power podcast. Catch us live weekdays at noon Eastern on Apple CarPlay and Android Auto with the Bloomberg Business app. Listen on demand wherever you get your podcasts or watch us live on YouTube.
DJT, look at that. This is basically $16 stock now after approaching 70. Where'd that top out? $66 a share. Lots changed since then, like the entire race. Thanks for joining us here on Balance of Power. I'm Joe Mathieu in Washington, the fastest show in politics. Not slowing down this day after the debate, even as we peek out of one eye. I don't know if you were with us for our special coverage last evening. We went through this all together here with Rick Davis and Jeanne, Zaino, and I'm deeply curious to hear what's on their mind. Having remembered the moment, it was right in the first half hour, maybe the first 20 minutes, when Kamala Harris reached into the bag to pull something out that she knew would upset Donald Trump. Of course, it came down to crowd size last night. Let's listen.
You will see during the course of his rallies, he talks about fictional characters like Hannibal Lecter. He will talk about windmills cause cancer. And what you will also notice is that people start leaving his rallies early out of exhaustion and boredom.
She said people start leaving. People don't go to her rallies. There's no reason to go. And the people that do go, she's bussing them in and paying them to be there.
The whole mood of the debate, the direction of the conversation, the tone and tenor, and the body language all seemed to change at that point. And here we are now today looking at a series of headlines indicating Donald Trump took the bait. How does the panel see it? They're back with us. Jeanne, Zaino, and Rick Davis. As I mentioned, Jeanne, of course, a senior democracy fellow with the Center for the Study of Presidency and Congress and political science professor at Iona University. Rick Davis, partner at Stone Court Capital, Republican strategist. Great to see you both. Jeanne, I was the guy questioning whether this was a worthy effort here. Why not simply go out and lay out your policy proposals, tell the American people what you want to do with the country instead of spending all this time prepping on how to needle Donald Trump, get it under his skin, trolling him before, try to draw him out on an open microphone. But was that, in fact, the right strategy?
It was the right strategy. I think this was a win for all of those of us who like to prepare. Kamala Harris was well prepped, well prepared, and she delivered. Donald Trump, on the other hand, he looked something like an incumbent president who's too busy to prepare, doesn't take this all that seriously, goes in there with one job to do, define Kamala Harris as too liberal, too dangerously liberal to be trusted with the keys to the White House. And he simply could not stick to that message. He kept getting distracted. And so from that perspective, she certainly got the better of him, consistently goading him into responding to things that, quite frankly, weren't going to help him, like crowd sizes.
Is it as simple as that, Rick? And did Donald Trump perform any worse last night than he did in the first debate?
I think he did a little bit worse this time. Obviously, he didn't, quote, take the bait in the first debate. He was driving the messaging against Joe Biden, and Joe Biden was taking the bait and trying to respond to his outlandish claims and in many cases non-factual statements. So never answer a lie with a fact. I mean, it just doesn't make sense in a debate. But I think there was a bit of an elegance to the way that Kamala Harris did the debate. And that was, not only did she troll Trump, bait him into getting off of substantive issues to talk about, things that drive his ego like crowd size, but then she tied that kind of behavior into how authoritarians like Putin and Xi can take advantage of him. And I didn't really notice it that much in real time, but afterwards, I really thought through the whole approach to the debate was very comprehensive in that she proved to Trump, to voters, to viewers, that Trump could take the bait, that he would be able to be played like that. And then she said, and others who don't have America's interests in mind play him the same way. And I thought, wow, that's a really interesting construct that they did, because it's a little subtle, but I thought it was very elegant.
Love to hear from you both on the moderators, because we're all hearing, and we were hearing before we left the air last night, 3-on-1 is the take of the Trump campaign. Senator Lindsey Graham tweeted, I mentioned this earlier, the moderators might as well be on the DNC payroll. This is ridiculous. This is the worst moderated debate in history. Jeanne, is he right?
No, I don't think it's the worst in history. I think Candy Crowley probably still owns that mantle. Love Candy Crowley. I think she still owns that one. But, there was points at which you could nitpick and say that they were fact-checking Trump more than they were fact-checking Harris. Harris did make some misstatements. The one that stood out to me had to do with the bloodbath comment. She took it out of context, could have been fact-checked. But that said, her comments were not as egregious as Donald Trump's were. And so that is the result of that. So, yeah, I think you can nitpick on the moderators, but the reality is Donald Trump did himself no favors in this debate. We have long said, and I will stand by this through the election, whoever this election is about is going to lose. That was true when it was Joe Biden as the Democratic nominee. Same thing for Harris and Trump. And last night, Donald Trump made it all about Donald Trump. And that is a problem. This is an egotistical guy. He does not want to make this about Kamala Harris, but that's unfortunately what he needs to do. Define her, talk about how liberal she is, talk about issues he wins on, like the economy, like security, like immigration, like inflation. He tried, but he just couldn't get out of his own way. So, I don't think you can blame the moderators for that as much, again, as you can nitpick on little things. I think both the moderators handled it as well as can be expected in a live broadcast. That's awfully difficult to do.
Rick, they did fact check Donald Trump 4 times on abortion, the idea of a post-birth abortion, claims about Haitian immigrants eating dogs and people's pets, violent crime going up when it was down in the 2020 election, whether it was stolen. Should they have fact-checked Kamala Harris more? Should they have fact-checked Donald Trump less? One thing I did notice is that the moderators let Donald Trump bend the rules a lot more. He managed to roll over them more than Kamala Harris, who was held to time. What's your thought?
Yeah, I mean, overall, I thought that the moderators did a great job. Donald Trump's maybe the hardest presidential contestant in a debate ever to manage. And by and large, most of the moderators that have had to moderate Donald Trump presidential debates have failed miserably. And I would point, to my good friend Jake Tapper and the CNN debate just a couple months ago. That was a disaster. And they had a gloves off policy. They let him say whatever he wanted to say. And it went unchecked. I think the 4 things you mentioned, I think our friend Lindsey Graham would actually never say those things because he knows them to be untrue statements. And so I'm not sure what part of that he would disagree with. On the other hand, and you make a good point, there were some things that the moderators could have fact-checked Kamala Harris on. But then again, the Harris campaign has a right to be complaining about the fact that she was cut off repeatedly, and Donald Trump, I don't think, was ever cut off. They let him go on and on. He added responses to everything that Kamala Harris said, even though it wasn't in the rules to do that. And so, look, I mean, these things are an art; they're not a science. The rules are set up to manage guardrails, not to dictate every activity in a debate. And for a network to do this, which is hard to do, and for the contestants to be willing to go in without an audience, with microphones turned off and all the rules that were, I thought it was a very well run debate. We should aspire to have these kinds of debates all the time, where if you lie, you get called out and you have plenty of time to make your case. And that is the case. Even the fact that they extended the time of the debate, outrageous, right? I mean, like nobody ever does that. Oh, let's give them another 10 minutes.
Right.
At that hour, I was ready for bed, but I thought it was actually a really great decision. People could take a lot from that, and I thought I thought it exceeded my expectations when it comes to creating a forum for both the candidates to be able to make their case.
There's a phrase we hear in the newsroom sometimes or in the studio: blow the brake. Because sometimes you have to go into overtime. Rick Davis and Jeanne Zaino, thank you. They were with us for the big dance last night. They'll be back with hour 2 here on Balance of Power, as we will welcome our global TV audience to the conversation. The big question a lot of us have, there going to be another one? Kind of felt like it last night, that Donald Trump might want to come back around and maybe take another swing at this here. The Harris campaign was welcoming it within minutes. Let's do that again, said Brian Fallon on Twitter, within moments of the debate ending. But this kind of took on a new wrinkle this morning. Fox and Friends, Donald Trump qualifying this idea. Fox has now floated a couple of dates to potentially do a second round in October, but it's very difficult to tell where we stand on that. And that's why we want to bring in Tyler Kendall. God bless Tyler, is still in Philadelphia, having been there for the duration yesterday, reporting for Bloomberg and producing our great coverage last night. Tyler, it is great to see you. What are you hearing on the ground this morning in Philadelphia?
Yeah, hey, Joe. So new this morning, former President Trump casting doubt on whether or not there will be a second debate, saying that he's not inclined to do one after, as you mentioned, the Harris campaign challenged him to one after last night's quickly concluded. We started to hear this messaging from Republicans pretty quickly after the debate last night in the spin room, including from former President Trump himself, who made a surprise visit to us reporters in the spin room, holding this impromptu press conference where he repeatedly said that if Harris has to do a second debate, that must mean that she has more explaining to do on her policies, but that he doesn't necessarily feel like he needs to do that. I heard pretty similar messaging from most Republican surrogates in the room last night. That includes Senator Marco Rubio, a Republican from Florida, of course, a former presidential candidate himself, someone we know was on the vice presidential shortlist for Trump's campaign. I asked him if Trump should engage and have a second debate. Take a listen to what he told me.
Maybe. I mean, I think he would do fine in a second debate. I think it's interesting she wants one. Usually, look, if you're winning, I've done debates. If you're winning a campaign, you don't want any more debates. Like, you're winning. Why do you want to expose yourself to something going wrong on the stage?
Now, Democrats, for their part, were incredibly eager to try to hold this second debate, all of the surrogates coming out. But what really struck me was just the sheer number of Democratic surrogates that came out and how quickly they started to fill the spin room floor. It stood in stark contrast to I was at the Atlanta debate, and we literally had to wait and hardly saw any Democratic surrogates come out after President Joe Biden's performance on the debate stage then. But Joe, I will quickly mention that one person who loomed pretty large but was not in the spin room was Taylor Swift and her endorsement of Vice President Kamala Harris shortly after the debate ended. That was pretty much a huge talker in the spin room last night as Democrats cheered the endorsement. But for his part, former President Donald Trump was asked about it this morning, and he said that he's not a fan.
Not a fan? I thought he was working on that endorsement. Tyler, thank God Tyler came on to mention. I haven't even mentioned Taylor Swift this hour. I am remiss. Thank you, Tyler. Travel safe to get home. Tyler Kendall in Philadelphia this day after the debate.
You're listening to the Bloomberg Balance of Power podcast. Catch us live weekdays at noon Eastern on Apple CarPlay and Android Auto with the Bloomberg Business app. You can also listen live on Amazon Alexa from our flagship New York station. Just say, Alexa, play Bloomberg 1130.
It was in the first, 10 minutes we got to inflation, the issues of the economy. We did hear from both candidates. Let's go to Philadelphia, Kamala Harris and Donald Trump.
My plan is to give a $50,000 tax deduction to startup small businesses, knowing they are part of the backbone of America's economy. My opponent, on the other hand, his plan is to do what he has done before, which is to provide a tax cut for billionaires and big corporations.
We've had a terrible economy because inflation which is really known as a country buster. It breaks up countries. We have inflation like very few people have ever seen before, probably the worst in our nation's history. This has been a disaster for people, for the middle class.
I don't know if it's a country buster or who calls it that, but it's a problem for Kamala Harris. And as I mentioned, if this had taken place yesterday, CPI that is, that conversation might have gone a bit differently here. This is something that has tested obviously very poorly for Kamala Harris. Look at our own Bloomberg News swing state poll with Morning Consult. This is the issue. Donald Trump beyond any other, except maybe the border. People trust Donald Trump more when it comes to how to handle the economy, when it comes to how to handle interest rates, when it comes to lowering prices. At least that was the narrative going into last night. Did that change at all? I've got a lot of questions for Frank Luntz, and what a great day to spend time with Mr. Luntz, politics, communications consultant, pollster, CEO of FIL. Frank, thanks for being up with us. It was a late night for everybody. And like I said, I want to go around the horn with you here for a minute. It's great to have you on the matter of the economy. As we look at this CPI data this morning, I saw you talking about markets earlier today. Did Kamala Harris convince anyone that she was the one to be best trusted with this issue?
It's a great question. I don't really think so. But she still performed much better than Donald Trump. Let's be completely accurate. She did not provide significant detail. She did not explain step by step what she's going to do starting on Inauguration Day. She's still very, very light with the details, but she answered the questions, and we do get an idea of where her priorities are. In Trump's case, when they asked him about his strongest issue, for some reason, he pivoted to immigration. And when they came back to it, he was talking about some other issue. There's a rule of politics, which is if you're defining the election, you're winning the election. And he absolutely did not do that last night. In fact, he gave away the definitions where he was strongest. So I don't think last night was a good night for America. And I know it was not a good night for Donald Trump.
The headlines this morning are something, if only in their continuity. Frank, Trump takes the bait is everywhere. It doesn't matter, it seems, where you're looking here. The New York Post headline is Cambush. Are they deserved?
Yes, and they're deserved because he should have known better. She's never had a podium like this. She's never had this opportunity. He did it in 2016. He did it in 2020. He's had the experience. Let me differentiate here because I want to be careful. His campaign in 2024 is better than the previous two. The candidate is what's worse. The campaign is running comparative ads. The campaign is focused on what Trump should be focused on to win this election. But the candidate, I don't know what it's like he didn't attend debate prep, or he didn't listen, or he didn't learn. I believe that most high school student body presidents would have out-debated Donald Trump last night, and I don't say that easily. And in the end, food and fuel, housing and healthcare, the sense of insecurity, the policies that matter most to Americans, Donald Trump has the advantage, as you started to say in the introduction. But you wouldn't have known that last night because that's not how he communicated. And in fact, I think it was so bad that it is quite possible that Harris will never agree to stand up next to him again, and then this campaign is over.
I'm going to get your thoughts on the moderators in a moment here, Frank, because I keep hearing 3 versus 1. But when I woke up this morning, the same thing was trending on Twitter than when I went to bed around 2 o'clock in the morning. They're eating the dogs. People talk about, the takeaways, the historic moments from the big campaigns, John Kennedy, whatever it might be. That's apparently the moment we're going to remember from the campaign. They're eating the dogs. Was that the moment that he lost?
That's the moment when people looked at each other and said, what the hell? When we actually had to get a check, we had to look at the transcript because it was so insane. And of course, Trump is not going to back down. Of course, he's not going to admit that he made a mistake, that he's not going to acknowledge that he got this wrong, because he doesn't do it. He was given the opportunity several times last night to acknowledge what every other American acknowledges: humility, decency, that you're not perfect. Well, here's the good news for Trump. He'll continue to complain that he's perfect and other people have got it wrong. and he'll be doing it from Mar-a-Lago, not from the White House. I can't begin to tell you how poor a performance he exhibited for the American people. Now, his conclusion was very strong, but the opening and for the first hour and almost hour and a half, that people were just scratching their heads wondering, what is up here? Is he actually trying to lose? That no human being could, with his experience, could actually be as ineffective, could say things. Calling Viktor Orban one of the great leaders in the world is, I'm literally speechless. And I've never been speechless on Bloomberg, and I've never been speechless in politics. It is so absolutely unfathomable, but that's exactly what he did.
You made a great point about the closing statements. Frank, this thing went into overtime, by the way. If you didn't watch it in real time, they got their second commercial break, and all of a sudden we're going 5 minutes late. Time for closing statements. And Donald Trump said something that I expected he was going to say at the very beginning of the debate. If you have all these good ideas for helping average Americans, why haven't you implemented them in the last 3.5 years that you've been in the White House? Frank, why didn't he do that first?
And because he was just so poorly prepped, or he's just really bad at this. We forget that he's old, that we made fun of Joe Biden for being 81 and Trump is almost 80. And that he's not the same person that he was 8 years ago or 4 years ago. Probably he forgot. Probably his irritability wasn't just Harris getting under his skin, but it's simply, we know older people, probably I've done it, that we get agitated and irritated if things don't go our way. We become more impatient. But you're not supposed to do that when you're running for president. You're not supposed to, you're supposed to have self-control. And we didn't see any of that last night. And I wonder how many people are telling Trump the truth. Because I've seen the tweets he's been sending out. He says it's his best debate ever. If he really believes that, then he actually is in real trouble emotionally, intellectually, and physically.
Well, he does say that this was 3-on-1, and he's not the only one saying that this morning, Frank. Your thoughts on the moderators? Lindsey Graham tweeted after the debate, the moderators might as well be on the DNC payroll. This is ridiculous. This is the worst moderated debate in history. The fact is, they fact-checked Donald Trump 4 times during that debate. First on abortion, when he said that it was legal in some states to kill a baby after it was born. The claims about Haitian immigrants we mentioned eating people's pets. Violent crime, said it's up, as you know, the FBI said it was down. And then the Stop the Steal thing, 2020, whether he actually won the election. Was that a justified effort to fact check him in real time? He's complimenting CNN this morning. Frank, should they have stopped down and fact checked Kamala Harris more than what we saw last night?
Look, perception's reality. And if the perception is that the moderators are biased, then there's something that's not right about what's happening. ABC had every right to hold people accountable. The public has every right to hear the truth, and the politicians have every responsibility to tell the truth. There's no attribute or value more important than the truth in these debates, conversations, and in the debate itself. And they found what Trump is saying to be wanting, to be questionable. Should they have done the same thing to Harris? Absolutely. And it did come across as being one-sided. And maybe that's because of the things that Trump said. I'm actually surprised that no one has asked me, even up to now, why is it that both mics were turned on? Why is it that you could actually hear the crosstalk between the two candidates?
Yeah.
That was part of the rules. And no one's talking about that.
They did reserve the right to do that, and I'm glad they let it happen, at least for a moment. Frank, I wish I had more time with you. I appreciate your insights, as always. Frank Luntz, this day after the debate, FIL, and of course, a familiar voice to our viewers and listeners here on Bloomberg. I'm Joe Mathieu in Washington.
You're listening to the Bloomberg Balance of Power podcast. Catch us live weekdays at noon Eastern on Apple CarPlay and Android Auto with the Bloomberg Business app. Listen on demand wherever you get your podcasts or watch us live on YouTube.
So much on this 11th of September. We thank you for joining us On the Wednesday edition of Balance of Power here on Bloomberg Radio, on the satellite and on YouTube, where you can always find us. Search Bloomberg Business News Live. As we bring the program to you live from Washington, just hours, it feels like, well, about 12 hours after we left here, after the grand debate last night that we're going to be talking a lot more about. With some words, not a lot of specifics in terms of policy delivered on Ukraine, on Israel, other matters of foreign policy, including the U.S. withdrawal from Afghanistan. But it is Ukraine we want to begin with our colleague from the Pentagon, Tony Capaccio, who's with us today following, of course, yet another important and emotional ceremony at the Pentagon this morning. Ukraine asking the U.S. and the U.K. for that matter, and this has been going on for months, to be able to use Western-made weapons offensively against Russia beyond the cross-border incursion that's already been had. Now, add Ben Cardin's voice to the story. Of course, Senate Foreign Relations Committee chair. He says the U.S. must act swiftly to ease these restrictions on Ukraine's use of U.S.-provided weapons against Russia, calling for greater flexibility in his statement to target Russian military assets to degrade Moscow's ability to harm the Ukrainian people. It's got a lot in common right now with some Republicans. House Armed Services Committee Chair Mike Rogers, House Foreign Affairs Committee Chair Michael McCaul making the same call. And you wonder if we are getting close to something, as we've seen this movie before. First it's a no, then it's a maybe. Then it ends up being a yes, it seems, eventually, whether we're talking about Abrams tanks or F-16s. Tony, it's great to see you. Thank you for being available on what I know is a busy day for you. Are we about to see evolution in these restrictions?
Yeah, that's my impression. The ATACMS issue is going to fall next.
The ATACMS are these
longer-range missiles that they actually gave these to Ukraine in March. They stealthily gave them to them as part of any arms package. They didn't disclose it until weeks later.
Having been asked for months to provide them.
Right. These are the longer-range versions. Back in October, they started using the shorter-range versions with a lot of effectiveness in Crimea. And the longer-range versions they've now been using in Crimea and other parts of Ukraine and in the narrow pocket in the north into Russia that the White House allowed. The debate now is whether to allow them to go longer into Ukraine. And I think that's going to change. Interesting, on below the surface, they have F-16s, but also the White House is reviewing whether to give them the JASSM long-range cruise missile, stealthy cruise missile that is qualified on U.S. aircraft. That can go like 300 or 400 or 500 miles within, and it's very precise coordinate. It has GPS coordinates that could destroy Russian bombers that drop these glide bombs at their bases, if in fact the administration allows that. That will be a bigger kahuna, so to speak, than the ATACMS almost.
How about that? We have no indication on where the administration is in this evolution, do we? Or whether Kamala Harris sees this differently than Joe Biden?
No, she's not going to go differently on this subject. Yeah. I mean, she is the vice president. She doesn't make the policy on this stuff. She advises.
But were she elected, you wonder if she might see it differently.
I'm thinking that it would continue. There'd be continuity there. I don't see any great change. But the JASSM decision will be a big one, almost bigger than the ATACMS issue. But they have ATACMS now and know how to use them. JASSMs, the pilots, F-16s would have to learn how to use them. So there's a learning curve.
Bigger picture with the weapon systems that we've mentioned that we were told were maybe not appropriate or useful or most efficient for Ukraine. I mentioned the Abrams tanks, the F-16s. Have people been proven wrong, or are these toys that are kind of hanging around that aren't being used well?
No, they're being modified. In fact, Kamala Harris in her weapons last night that she talked about in terms of beefing up Ukraine and U.S., she actually mentioned the Abrams in one of her sentences. Well, no, my understanding is the Ukrainians have come up with ways to protect Abrams from kamikaze drones in terms of top cover on the tanks and on the Bradleys. So there's been no great stories saying that the Bradleys haven't been effective or Abrams haven't been effective. The issue is maneuver and visibility. Drones take a lot of that away in terms of where the tanks, the ground systems are.
Interesting. To what extent is this argument over government funding going to become a challenge for the Pentagon? I know I'm sneaking up on you on this, but I keep hearing Chair of Armed Services, the Pentagon itself, a 6-month stopgap will impact readiness. What do they say? What do they mean when they say that?
What it means is that certain funding will not be allocated. I'm not sure how operations and maintenance would be effective or pay. What would be effective are new contracts for sure. Okay. And the
You just
Columbia.
wonder how much of that is bluster when you're talking about this in a budget debate.
Yeah, this has been the last. This happens every year, every year annually. The Pentagon's learned to adjust. GIO the General Government Accountability Office did a pretty good report a couple of years ago, 3-4 years ago, talking about how the Pentagon's learned to work around these restrictions. So it's not as cataclysmic as it once was, but the language of cataclysm continues. I'm skeptical of how impactful it is. I mean, a year would be bad.
Yeah, sure.
A year would be bad, but the troops would get paid. It's new contracts would not be issued, and there would be impacts on current contracts, but it's not new contracts.
Yeah, I just know nobody follows the money quite like you do at the Pentagon. I bet you I thought the same thing that you did when I walked out the front door this morning. Go out to walk the dog, you're going to work or whatever it was. Walk out the front door. The weather was exactly today like it was 23 years ago.
You're right, it was.
That crystal blue sky, the crisp fall air. It's been 23 years since 9/11. You were going to work that day, coming up the escalator when everybody was coming down. Now, you can take the metro, people should know, to the Pentagon.
Right.
What do you remember from that?
I remember pretty well.
Did you get in the building?
We didn't get into the building. I was going up the escalators, which no longer exist, by the way.
Yep.
The walls all blocked off. And the people were coming down the other two. It was urgent, but it wasn't panic. And I heard some people say, get out, the building's about to blow. Nobody knew what happened.
It had been struck.
But just so you know, we were on the opposite end of where the plane hit. It was the day of the locust, so to speak. Your phones were crickets. You heard crickets. I had a Motorola StarTech. Nobody had smartphones, by the way.
Right.
We had beepers.
Yes, we did.
For hours and hours, nobody really knew in that area. It was a war zone in other parts of the building. Where I was, people were milling, kind of mindlessly milling and confused. We did watch the wedge fall. I was with Tom Bowman, then with the Baltimore Sun. We were interviewing a guy who was in tattered clothing. So it wasn't panic. There wasn't a lot of knowledge. It wasn't until later in the day that we knew that a plane had hit. But why that wedge just collapsed. It looked like a prize fighter, I told another reporter, with its teeth knocked out, but the boxer was still standing.
Incredible. You then spent many hours, of course, going through news conferences. I'll never forget walking home. I was in the press building at that time and walking home down the center lane of Connecticut Avenue without a car in sight. Is this something that we'll never quite forget, that feeling in Washington by the end of the day? But before those quiet moments came, and it was the confusion, the madness, how long was it? Because we don't have photographs of that impact outside for some stray security camera video. How long until you realized what had happened at the Pentagon?
It was later that day. Someone pointed to me an FBI agent who knew what was going on. So I ran up to this FBI agent, and he turned out to be, he worked for WUSA 9. He put his, and he drove
Local
away.
TV
He
station.
says, I'll talk to you later. So he came back to me later, and he gave me a great quote. He actually saw the plane hit. He said, I could see those double A's
You're kidding.
on the plane as it hit the Pentagon.
Oh my
we
God.
used that quote in one of our stories, but yeah, it was the knowledge was, there was no knowledge of what happened, basically. You thought it was a bomb. I was there till like 2 a.m. Covering a lot of this, and then I covered the Rumsfeld, Henry Shelton press conference. Rumsfeld was very Secretary of Defense that night.
Yes, he was.
And he said the Pentagon will be open for business the next day, and it was.
Really something. You still work there with a lot of people who were in the building that day.
Less and less.
Well,
but,
I believe that. What does it mean, though? And it's 23 years later on a morning like this, the President of the United States comes by for the memorial.
Well, it gives you a sense that the vulnerability of institutions.
How about that?
And the need for eternal vigilance. I don't want to sound too much like a massive hawk here, but the need for vigilance and the resilience of a human spirit to not only take that tragedy and inculcate it, but keep moving on, keep working it. And the building was functional the next day. It was full of smoke, and the National Guard armed National Guard, but we found out they didn't have bullets in their clips. But flames are still billowing in parts of the building, and clouds of smoke and acrid,
went on for
ugly
some time.
smoke. So the human spirit survived that day, and it was a day of resilience that Americans can be proud of.
This is why I wanted you to come on today, because this is the stuff that informs your worldview. I'll never forget, up at Arlington, you could go up there and look down at the Blue Drape for a long time before that was repaired. I was on the other side of the river from you, And I came out of Metro Center. I was underground when the Pentagon was hit, and I came out to the sound of fighter jets, saw the smoke, and you said it perfectly. People thought it was a bomb. They thought, remember there was a report that the State Department had been bombed that day.
Right.
It was the confusion in that moment that's hard to forget.
And it was an undocumented crime because nobody had cell phones.
Right.
I ended up buying 3 rolls of quarters from the Ritz-Carlton guest shop. I skivvied down.
That's a real reporter.
I skivvied down from a highway. Spider walked down. I borrowed $20 from a flack I knew he was standing by Macy's.
Yeah.
And I only owed 10. I bought 3 rolls of quarters, and we used that throughout the day to make phone calls to my office. And I gave
You were a
quarters out to
reporter's
others.
best friend, is what you were.
I was.
Everybody who was here that day has a story like that. Everyone who was in New York has a story, or Shanksville, of course. And I'm really glad that you could come on to talk to us. You know, we spent a lot of time this week on the U.S. withdrawal from Afghanistan. Wouldn't be talking about it if it weren't for what happened 23 years ago today.
23 years ago set the stage for Iraq, that disaster, and then Afghanistan.
I hope you have a good day. Thank you for sharing part of it with us. Tony Capaccio doing great work, as always, on behalf of Bloomberg. Thanks for listening to the Balance of Power podcast. Make sure to subscribe if you haven't already at Apple, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. And you can find us live every weekday from Washington, D.C. at noontime Eastern at Bloomberg.com.